Hey, Greg Palmer here from Finovate. Today I'm talking with Nicole Klein, Senior Director of Open Finance at MX. Nikki, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a pretty simple question. Why does open banking matter to banks?
Sure. There's actually a lot to this question, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. There are a few main reasons why. When I ask people at banks why they built an open banking API, the first thing that I hear is to reduce fraud. So these APIs are tokenized, which means their customers don't have to enter usernames and passwords on another app. Instead, the user will get redirected back to their financial institution instead, and then a token is sent from where the account is to the third-party app through an MX or something like this. So it's much, much safer. If there's one reason to do it, open banking APIs provide safe, secure ways for people to share accounts without having to enter their credentials in places they shouldn't have to. And banks want to be able to protect their customers. I think a second reason is there's potentially a regulatory inevitability. Many countries in Europe, Australia, and more have open banking regulations already, and I think it will eventually come to the US. Canada's working on that now as well. So we're not quite there yet, but many in the industry predict that we will be. I would say a third reason is the customer experience, of course, an important one. So it's simply a better user experience if people can connect their accounts easily and reliably. People connect their bank or credit union accounts to multiple different apps, and our research shows on average 7 different apps. So it's a lot, and it's been growing over the years as well. If people feel like they can't do that easily or the data is not accurate because it's still being done through screen scraping, people blame their bank. They don't really blame the fintech app, the data recipient, or the intermediary like MX. So a lot of banks hear this in their call center, like, why can't I connect my account to this other app? So it's really in their best interest to make sure their customers can use these apps that have become such an important part of their customers' lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned an interesting phrase there, regulatory inevitability. And I think this is one of those pieces which I think you're right. It certainly looks like that's the way the world is going. And it's obviously something which has already happened in a lot of markets outside the United States. But there are people who are adopting open banking solutions even when the regulations are not requiring it. Who's driving that kind of adoption?
Yep. In the US, I think it's that we're seeing these regulatory changes throughout the world. So it seems like it's probably inevitable here next. While it might not be the most exciting reason to do open banking, many of the large financial institutions know what it's like from past experiences to have to react quickly to new regulations, and getting ahead of that is a good idea. It allows them to maybe even potentially get a head start in shaping what the regulations may eventually look like. I think the largest banks are driving it. And for the most part, not all, but for the most part, they seem to be on the same page of what that standardization should be for open banking APIs and what kinds of data should be shared and to who. So they're really setting themselves up for success in the future and not having to scramble to react to what the requirements may be in the coming years. And of course, from the question before, there are many reasons why companies are embracing open banking in the best interest of their customers without the government requiring it.
Yeah, this is one of the fun things we saw when we were running our European events. And initially, the open banking requirements were viewed as a gigantic pain to a lot of the companies and the banks who were involved there. And as they started engaging with the space, they started to see a lot of benefits that were coming out of it that they hadn't anticipated. And it became something that was not just the alleviation of a pain point, but also there were a lot of positives that would come from it as well. You talked about different kinds of financial institutions. Is it just financial institutions like banks and credit unions who need to be aware of what's going on in this space?
Well, I know that many people who work in fintech and not necessarily at a bank or credit union listen to this podcast. So I love this question. I definitely want to acknowledge where they fit into this as well. So I don't see them as just being the recipients of the data, right? They're not just the third-party apps in the industry. Increasingly, fintechs are not just the recipients of bank data. Many of them, as they grow, they're also data providers. And I'd love to start seeing them look at themselves that way to consider these solutions as well. So I totally see a world where people connect their BNPL accounts to their bank. They're already doing that for sure with crypto exchanges and payments apps and other examples as well. So That being said, banks, who we think of in these conversations as just the data providers, are also the data recipients. So it's kind of like what comes around goes around. People are sharing data in so many different directions, which is why open banking, or really we're talking about open finance now, is such a win-win-win for everyone, because whether you're receiving the data or you're delivering it, or you're the user who's actually just trying to have a good customer experience, or a company like MX, everybody benefits from the secure sharing of data. And a really fast growing use case is people just trying to connect an account to set up an ACH payment. And that could be to pay for anything like a plumber, right? Or just a medical bill. So if you're the user trying to connect your account, that's not even a fintech experience to them. It's just an everyday life experience. So I really want all the banks and credit unions and fintechs and anybody in this space to really think about it that way. You're just facilitating your customers to have these everyday life experiences, maybe just to pay the plumber. And everybody benefits from being able to make that a good experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think the best technology is the technology you don't even see, right? It's the technology you don't think about. It enables you to do something in a way that's really just easy and smooth, which ultimately I think is where open banking has so much potential. Open finance, I should say, has so much potential to really impact kind of end customers' lives. So there's this kind of big question when it comes to banks considering engaging. Is it better to build or is it better to buy? Because these are kind of obviously that's a really big one to try and wrap your head around.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's great that banks now even have options, right? I mean, for so many different solutions have come out over the past year alone. So banks don't have to do it themselves like they used to. If they choose to do so, if they choose to do it in-house, I'd recommend becoming a member of FTX. Do that first. You'll learn about the industry standard for open banking APIs, see if you can connect with other banks in the industry, learn from people who have gone through the process before, learn from your peers. But I know that the dev work does usually take over a year, and it requires a lot of dedicated resources. It's a big investment, worth it in my opinion, but you don't have to do it that way anymore. So outsourcing the work does seem to be the direction most are going in now. And I'll do a small MX plug. We do have an open banking product called MX Access. We demoed it at Finovate last year, actually. We'll build your FTX API for you, depending on the company's tech stack. It can take just a couple of months to get that up and running. And you can use it with other aggregators. This is not just for MX. So we want it to be able to solve all your open banking needs by providing tokenized connections to any data recipient your customers may want to connect to. And the data provider has full control through a dashboard. But, people out there listening, do your research. There are other options. I always want to encourage everyone to choose something that is designed with their best interest in mind, giving them, as the data provider in this case, control and insight on what their customers are connecting their accounts to.
Yeah, I had a feeling we might hear about some of the MX capabilities, and I was asking that question. And I mean, who could resist the kind of ability to hit that one out of the park? So, the next question I have for you: what's a best practice for an FI when it comes to how to implement open banking with the organization, and who should own it?
Yeah. Well, if you do it in-house, I think you should expect to have a dedicated team. A lot of banks do have people with open banking in their title now. That didn't exist a couple of years ago. So it's an exciting new change that we're seeing. If you outsource it, you'll still need to have people who are dedicated to the process. They'll manage the partnerships with aggregators and data recipients that are accessing the APIs. You'll need people to manage it from a product perspective. But I think the best advice I can give someone when it comes to just moving forward and even looking into this from the first place, other than joining FTX, which I mentioned, is have people on the product and customer experience side connect with their fraud and security teams. Because reducing fraud and improving customer experience are really such big parts of why anyone's doing this. So having those teams speak to each other is such a good idea to just figure out what the right solution is, and then sharing the benefits of doing it as well.
Well, you're talking about internal communication. I don't know if we can sort that out.
Well, that's the problem, is a lot of times those teams are siloed and they don't even know each other. So whenever we have these conversations, I try to recommend, bring people in from other places at your company that you wouldn't normally work with. And I think that's the best way to move forward.
Totally. And certainly when it comes to something like this, which does touch a lot of different areas within an organization, it's really important that you bring everybody on board from the beginning. So, what should banks be thinking about when they're choosing who to partner with when it comes to open banking? What are some of the pieces they have to keep in mind?
Sure. Well, as a big believer in open banking, I think the end goal should absolutely be to work with all the large aggregators. Here at MX, working with us first would mean tokenized data to over 2,000 apps spanning banks, credit unions, fintechs. But also, we're a great first partner because we have so much experience in the space. We've been one of, if not the first mover away from screen scraping to APIs. And if it's your first data out open banking relationship, you want to work with a company that has years of experience signing data access agreements with many of the largest banks in the country already. But really, the end goal should be see where your customers are connecting to and make sure that you're covering all your bases and work with everybody in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, so much data is available now. It's really possible to understand what customers are doing, what they're trying to do in a way that we haven't been able to before. And if you keep those end users in mind, you really can't go too far astray as you think about what capabilities you want to offer. You brought up something earlier that I want to come back and talk about, the financial data exchange. Can you expand on what exactly that is and why it matters?
Sure. So FDX, the Financial Data Exchange, is a nonprofit organization with over 200 members in the industry. Those members are banks, credit unions, intermediaries like MX, many fintechs, and it gives us all the opportunity to meet as an industry to create agreed upon standards for open banking APIs, like how they should be structured, what types of data should be shared. And that standardization can make it easier to stand up an API in the first place because you can follow these guidelines and learn from others. And it's also easier for the companies that code to it because it's familiar and we know we can likely get the data we need to meet the most common use cases. So like transaction level data, account and routing number, and more. So if we can all count on reliable data sharing, we can focus on innovation as an industry. So I think that the FDX standards are incredibly important.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm glad that it exists. I think it's something which, again, if you look at kind of the early days of open banking and open finance, they would have dreamed for something along those lines to just make the process so much smoother. Last question. I know you've got the Money Experience Summit coming up September 20th through the 22nd. Obviously, that's a really great opportunity to bring in people from all over the country and kind of talk about what's going on in the world of fintech and specifically in the world of MX. What is MX doing, and how will you kind of be representing open banking, open finance at that Money Experience Summit?
Well, Money Experience Summit in September is our conference at Snowbird in Utah. And we're putting on a few days of content from experts in the industry. So it's an amazing opportunity to network with industry leaders on open banking and learn from them. We will have many people who have stood up these APIs. Some of them were the first banks to do it in the country a couple of years ago. And they'll be on stage and they'll be there for, hanging out with us for a couple of days. So we really hope people listening to this can make it and learn more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It looks like a really fun event. Nikki, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Obviously, there's, I think, still more to come in the world of open banking and open finance. We're really just kind of scratching the surface right now, but obviously a lot of promise, a lot of opportunity that's out there, and would encourage anybody who's listening or watching to follow up and learn more about what all is possible because there's some very exciting things happening. So, Nikki, thank you again.
Thank you, Greg.